Chapter 7. A Chapter of Red Herrings. Thence came forth Maul, a giant. This Maul did use to spoil young pilgrims with sophistry. Bunyan. From the admission that God exists, and is the author of nature, it by no means follows that miracles must, or even can, occur. God himself might be a being of such a kind that it was contrary to his character to work miracles. Or again, he might have made nature the sort of thing that cannot be added to, subtracted from, or modified. The case against miracles accordingly relies on two different grounds. You either think that the character of God excludes them, or that the character of nature excludes them. We will begin with the second, which is the more popular ground. In this chapter I shall consider forms of it which are, in my opinion, very superficial, which might even be called misunderstandings or red herrings. The first red herring is this. Any day you may hear a man, and not necessarily a disbeliever in God, say of some alleged miracle, No, of course not. No, of course I don't believe that. We know it is contrary to the laws of nature. People could believe it in olden times because they didn't know the laws of nature. We know now that it is a scientific impossibility. End quote. By the laws of nature, such a man means, I think, the observed course of nature. If he means anything more than that, he is not the plain man I take him for, but a philosophic naturalist, and will be dealt with in the next chapter. The man I have in view believes that mere experience, and especially that those artificially contrived experiences which we call experiments, can tell us what regularly happens in nature, and he thinks that what we have discovered excludes the possibility of miracle. This is a confusion of mind. Granted that miracles can occur, it is, of course, for experience to say whether one has done so on any given occasion. The mere experience, even if prolonged for 1,000,000 years, cannot tell us whether the thing is possible. Experiment finds out what regularly happens in nature, the norm or rule to which she works. Those who believe in miracles are not denying that there is such a norm or rule. They are only saying that it can be suspended. A miracle is by definition an exception. How can the discovery of the rule tell you whether, granted a sufficient cause, the rule can be suspended? If we said that the rule was A, then experience might refute us by discovering that it was B. If we said that there was no rule, then experience might refute us by observing that there is. But we are saying neither of these things. We agree that there is a rule, and that the rule is B. What has that got to do with the question whether the rule can be suspended? You reply, quote, but experience shows that it never has, end quote. We reply, quote, even if that were so, this would not prove that it never can be. But does experience show that it never has? The world is full of stories of people who say they have experienced miracles. Perhaps the stories are false. Perhaps they are true. But before you can decide on that historical question, you must first, as was pointed out in Chapter 1, discover whether the thing is possible, and if possible, how probable. End quote. The idea that the progress of science has somehow altered this question is closely bound up with the idea that people, in olden times, believe in them because they didn't know the laws of nature. Thus you will hear people say, the early Christian believed that Christ was the Son of the Virgin, but we know that that is a scientific impossibility. Such people seem to have an idea that belief in miracles arose at a period when men were so ignorant of the course of nature that they did not perceive a miracle to be contrary to it. A moment's thought shows this to be nonsense, and the story of the virgin birth is a particularly striking example. So you've heard this kind of argument before. You've heard that kind of objection that the miracles are not possible because the laws of nature prevent it. That there is a constitution to nature of sorts, and that constitution prohibits certain things from happening. It guides nature in one way and restricts it from going in another. This is a pretty common. Objection to miracle. It's a pretty sometimes it's even an objection to the existence of God, but it's definitely an objection to the concept of miracle. That miracle is even possible. The laws of nature prevent it. So Lewis points out, well, we've got laws do exist. People who assert that a miracle has happened aren't denying that laws exist. What they're saying is that this is an exception to that law. They're saying that the law was suspended for the moment. And they may be even saying something more than that, but they're at least saying that. The miracle that he is probably the most substantial miracle in the whole canon of the biblical experience, other than the creation of the universe, is the virgin birth. It's the one that strikes the ear most, with most force, because there you have something that almost no one could deny. Even children probably couldn't deny that this is something that doesn't ever occur. Women who've never been with a man don't have babies. Both parties are required for that eventuality. So he takes up that miracle here, and he says, when Saint Joseph discovered that his fiancée was going to have a baby, he not unnaturally decided to repudiate her, or reject her. Why? Because he knew, just as well as any modern gynecologist, that in the ordinary course of nature, women do not have babies unless they have lain with men. No doubt the modern gynecologist knows several things about birth and begetting, which Saint Joseph did not know, but those things do not concern the main point, that a virgin birth is contrary to the course of nature, and Saint Joseph obviously knew that. In any sense, in which it is true to say now, the thing is scientifically impossible, he would have said the same. The thing always was, and was always known to be, impossible unless the regular processes of nature were, in this particular case, being overruled or supplemented by something from beyond nature. When Saint Joseph finally accepted the view that his fiancée's pregnancy was due not to unchastity, but to a miracle, he accepted the miracle as something contrary to the known order of nature. This sort of flies in the face of the idea that people in the past accepted miracles because they were just so naive, that they were just so willing to accept miracle. Joseph's first reaction to that message from God is to doubt it, is to doubt Mary, to think she's cheated on me. She's cheated on the contract that I had to marry her. She's been unfaithful. It wasn't to think, well, I'll just, sure, yeah, babies are born to virgins. Yeah, that's something I can swallow without any objections. His first reaction is, as Lewis says, to repudiate her, to get rid of her, to say, well, the marriage is off, because they hadn't been married yet. All records of miracles teach the same thing. In such stories, the miracles excite fear and wonder, that is, what the very word miracle implies, among the spectators, and are taken as evidence of supernatural power. If they were not known to be contrary to the laws of nature, how could they suggest the presence of the supernatural? How could they be surprising unless they were seen to be exceptions to the rules? And how can anything be seen to be an exception to the rules are known? If there ever were men who did not know the laws of nature at all, they would have no idea of a miracle and feel no particular interest in one if it were performed before them. Nothing can seem extraordinary until you have discovered what is ordinary. Belief in miracles, far from depending on an ignorance of the laws of nature, is only possible insofar as those laws are known. We have already seen that if you begin by ruling out the supernatural, you will perceive no miracles. We must now add that you will equally perceive no miracles until you believe that nature works according to regular laws. If you have not yet noticed that the sun always rises in the east, you will see nothing miraculous about his rising one morning in the west. So miracle implies a deviation from the ordinary. If you don't know what the ordinary is, a perception of a miracle will never occur to you. You'll never even be sensitive to the idea that it's occurred. I can't remember if Lewis brings this up in this chapter, but babies are like this at a magic show. They're completely unimpressed by what's taking place in front of them. A magician can pull a rabbit out of a hat, and they're not wowed by the rabbit coming out of the hat in the same way that the audience is. How did he do that? Because the baby has no experience with the ordinary. It doesn't know that this is a deviation from it, because it doesn't have enough experience to know. It hasn't learned that rabbits don't come out of hats, and so it's completely unimpressed by it. If the miracles were offered as events that normally occurred, then the progress of science, whose business is to tell us what normally occurs, would render belief in them gradually harder and finally impossible. The progress of science has in just this way, and greatly to our benefit, made all sorts of things incredible which our ancestors believed. Man-eating ants, and griffins in Scythia, men with one single gigantic foot, magnetic islands that draw all ships toward them, mermaids and fire-breathing dragons. But those things were never put forward as supernatural interruptions of the course of nature. They were put forward as items within her ordinary course. In fact, as science. That's an interesting thing about a lot of the mythology of the past, is that a lot of the mythology of the past is not put forward as a miraculous event. It's put forward as just how things work. Nature itself works this way. Nature itself has manifested an island that is magnetic and draws all ships toward it. Nature itself has created a situation where Hercules is able to hold up the world on his shoulders. That's the way things are. It wasn't a deviation. It wasn't an interruption of nature by supernature. It was just how nature happens to work, and there are gods in it. They were put forward as items within her ordinary course, in fact, as science. Later and better science has therefore rightly removed them. Miracles are in a wholly different position. If there were fire-breathing dragons, our big game hunters would find them. But no one ever pretended that the virgin birth or Christ's walking on the water could be reckoned on to occur. When a thing professes from the very outset to be a unique invasion of nature by something from outside, increasing knowledge of nature can never make it either more or less credible than it was at the beginning. In this sense, it is mere confusion of thought to suppose that advancing science has made it harder for us to accept miracles. We always knew they were contrary to the natural course of events. We know still that if there is something beyond nature, they are possible. Those are the bare bones of the question. Time and progress and science and civilization have not altered them in the least. The grounds for belief and disbelief are the same today as they were 2,000 or 10,000 years ago. If Saint Joseph had lacked faith to trust God or humility to perceive the holiness of his spouse, he could have disbelieved in the miraculous origin of her son as easily as any modern man. And any modern man who believes in God can accept the miracle as easily as Saint Joseph did. You and I might not agree, even by the end of this book, as to whether miracles happen or not, but at least let us not talk nonsense. Let us not allow a vague rhetoric about the march of science to fool us into supposing that the most complicated account of birth, in terms of genes and spermatozoa, leaves us any more convinced than we were before that nature does not send babies to young women who know not a man. The second red herring is this. Many people say they could believe in miracles in olden times because they had a false conception of the universe. They thought the earth was the largest thing in it, and man the most important creature. It therefore seemed reasonable to suppose that the Creator was specially interested in man, and might even interrupt the course of nature for his benefit. But now that we know the real immensity of the universe, now that we perceive our own planet and even the whole solar system to be only a speck, it becomes ludicrous to believe in them any longer. We have discovered our significance and can no longer suppose that God is so drastically concerned in our petty affairs. Whatever its value may be as an argument, it may be stated at once that this view is quite wrong about facts. The immensity of the universe is not a recent discovery. More than 1,700 years ago, Ptolemy Ptolemy taught that in relation to the distance of the fixed stars, the whole earth must be regarded as a point with no magnitude. His astronomical system was universally accepted in the Dark and Middle Ages. The insignificance of Earth was as much a commonplace to Boethius, King Alfred, Dante, and Chaucer as it is to Mr. H.G. Wells or Professor Haldane. Statements to the contrary in modern books are due to ignorance. The real question is quite different from what we commonly suppose. The real question is why the spatial insignificance of Earth, after being asserted by Christian philosophers, sung by Christian poets, and commented on by Christian moralists for some 15 centuries, without the slightest suspicion that it conflicted with their theology, should suddenly, in quite modern times, have been set up as a stock argument against Christianity and enjoyed in that capacity a brilliant career. I will offer a guess at the answer to this question presently. For the moment, let us consider the strength of this stock argument. So we can see Lewis is attacking this idea from the outset on purely historical grounds. The idea that the Earth is an insignificant speck in relation to the rest of the universe was pretty widely believed long before the modern era. Now, the exact dimensions of the universe, how far light travels in a year, how far the Earth is from another star, these things weren't known exactly, but the idea that man felt that that Earth dominated all the universe, that's not the case. Man has probably always seen Earth as a small speck in relation to everything else. And this is seen in, as he points out, it's been sung about by poets, it's been written about by philosophers, it's been mused about by what passed for scientists in the past. So it's not like they didn't know it, and up until very recently, all of those mentions of it, the smallness of the Earth in relation to the size of the universe, never occurred to the Christians of that time as being an objection or somehow a problem for their theology. They not only accepted it, but sang about it. So it's not why it should be considered something so why it should be considered such a forceful argument now against Christianity is really puzzling. But he says, hey, let's look at the argument and see if it has any weight. When the doctor at a post-mortem looks at the dead man's organs and diagnoses poison, he has a clear idea of the different state in which the organs would have been if the man had died a natural death. If from the vastness of the universe and the smallness of Earth we diagnose that Christianity is false, we ought to have a clear idea of the sort of universe we should have expected if it were true. But have we? And this, to me, I like it. Lewis could stop the argument here, and I would feel like, well, the argument is dead, right? He takes a doctor who looks at someone who's died, cuts him open, and he says, well, this guy died of poison. How can he deduce that from looking at his organs? Well, because he knows what they're supposed to look like, and this isn't what they look like. Right now, they look like someone who's been killed by poison. We could do that with the universe. If the size of the universe is supposed to tell us, and Earth's insignificance in relation to that size is supposed to tell us that God doesn't exist, what would the universe look like if God did exist? This is a question no one thinks to answer, right? So, that to me is like, well, the whole thing was silly this whole time. You know, the argument was silly from the outset. He's going to take it further, but as a personal aside, I feel like that just sort of, that kind of question, that sort of simple two sentences that Lewis has written here at the beginning of this paragraph, completely disarms the argument for me. And I think it would for most people if you just said, well, what would you expect the universe to look like if God did exist? I doubt much of a response would come back. We can continue here, but to me, that's sort of the death knell of this argument. Whatever space may really be, it is certain that our perceptions make it appear three-dimensional, and to a three-dimensional space no boundaries are conceivable. By the very forms of our perceptions, therefore, we must feel as if we lived somewhere in infinite space, and whatever size the Earth happens to be, it must of course be very small in comparison with infinity. and this infinite space must either be empty or contain bodies. If it were empty, if it contained nothing but our own sun, then that vast vacancy would certainly be used as an argument against the very existence of God. Why, it would be asked, should he create one speck and leave all the rest of space to non-entity? If, on the other hand, we find, as we actually do, countless bodies floating in space, they must be either habitable or uninhabitable. Now, the odd thing is that both alternatives are equally used as objections to Christianity. If the universe is teeming with life other than ours, then this, we are told, makes it quite ridiculous to believe that God should be so concerned with the human race as to, quote, come down from heaven, end quote, and be made man for its redemption. If, on the other hand, our planet is really unique in harboring organic life, then this is thought to prove that life is only an accidental byproduct in the universe, and so again to disprove our religion. We treat God as the policeman in the story treated the suspect. Whatever he does, quote, will be used in evidence against him, end quote. The kind of objection to the Christian faith is not really based on the observed nature of the actual universe at all. You can make it without waiting to find out what the universe is like, for it will fit any kind of universe we choose to imagine. The doctor here can diagnose poison without looking at the corpse, for he has a theory of poison, which he will maintain whatever the state of the organ turn out to be. The reason why we cannot even imagine a universe so built as to exclude these objections is, perhaps, as follows. Man is a finite creature who has sense enough to know that he is finite. Therefore, on any conceivable view, he finds himself dwarfed by reality as a whole. He is also a derivative being. The cause of his existence lies not in himself, but immediately in his parents, and ultimately either in the character of nature as a whole, or, if there is a God, in God. But there must be something, whether it be God or the totality of nature, which exists in its own right, or goes on of its own accord, not as the product of causes beyond itself, but simply because it does. In the face of that something, whichever it turns out to be, man must feel his own derived existence to be unimportant, irrelevant, almost accidental. There is no question of religious people fancying that all exists for man, and scientific people discovering that it does not. Whether the ultimate and inexplicable being, that which simply is, turns out to be God or the whole show, of course it does not exist for us. On either view, we are faced with something which existed before the human race appeared, and will exist after the earth has become uninhabitable, which is utterly independent of us, though we are totally dependent on it, and which, though through vast ranges of its being, has no relevance to our own hopes and fears. So Lewis handles this and says, well, it's not like man has ever felt he was super special. When man looks at the universe, whether he looks at it as a purely naturally derived phenomenon or looks at it as a supernaturally derived phenomenon, he doesn't look at it he's never really looked at it and said man is all that special, especially his own individual life. He's never really felt that it's all that special. It goes on with him or without him. That fact alone implies and sort of stirs up in each person the idea that you're not all that important to the process. The process of nature goes on of its own accord. It's not like if I die, it won't go on, or if you die, it won't go on. It'll go on with or without us. In fact, our death is a product of its going on, right? So, or if he looks at nature and says, well, it's derived from God, and is God kindled at the very least, or God orchestrated, then he still doesn't believe that he's still really never believed that he's all that important. He has always understood that God is much bigger than him, and that God's plans for this process are much bigger than him. And even this is even clearer in much of the poetry, the wandering about, the musing about God in religious texts, the Bible, as much as any other religious text, where where prophets and psalmists have been sort of amazed that God would care about man at all. They didn't say, well, of course, they didn't take the attitude or the tack, the position that, well, of course God cares about us. Look how great we are. That's never really been the position that the religious person has taken. It's almost always been the religious person being stunned at, grateful for, and amazed by God's interest in man at all. So the religious person recognizes the position he's in as much as the scientist does. He recognizes we're small, the earth is small, I'm small on the earth. What significance could I possibly have? And yet, here you are, loving me, caring for me, instructing me, guiding me, interested in me. Why? This amazes the psalmist. This amazes the prophet. It doesn't unimpress. They're not nonplussed by that fact. For no man was, excuse me, for no man was, I suppose, ever so mad as to think that man, or all creation, filled the divine mind. If we are a small thing to space and time are a much smaller thing to God. It is a profound mistake to imagine that Christianity ever intended to dissipate the bewilderment and even the terror, the sense of our own nothingness, which come upon us when we think about the nature of things. It comes to intensify them. And Christianity, he's saying, comes to intensify those feelings, not to remove them. Without such sensations, there is no religion. Many a man, brought up in the glib profession of some shallow form of Christianity, who comes through reading astronomy to realize for the first time how majestically indifferent most reality is to man, and who perhaps abandons his religion on that account, may at that moment be having his first genuinely religious experience. So you imagine this guy who has this sort of glib, drab version of Christianity that he's been brought up in his whole life. Maybe he starts reading about astronomy and realizes, gets a sense of how large the universe is and how much this process goes on in complete ignorance of and complete non-interest in man, and then abandons Christianity on that account. He says this guy probably at that moment is having his first religious experience, because religion is there to instill that in you, that sense of insignificance. It's not, or instill it and even emphasize it. It's not there to remove it and say, look how great man is. It's not there to do that. It's there to go, you're not great, and yet God loves you. So the man who rejects that glib, drab version of Christianity that he had been brought up on because of a sense of, let's say, wonder or awe or immensity at the size of the universe and man's insignificant place in it, or his seeming insignificant place in it. At that moment, Lewis says, he's probably having his first religious experience, even though he's rejecting Christianity, or at least the version he was raised on. Christianity does not involve the belief that all things were made for man. It does involve the belief that God loves man, and for his sake became man and died. I have not yet succeeded in seeing how what we know, and have known since the days of Ptolemy, about the size of the universe affects the credibility of this doctrine one way or the other. The skeptic asks how we can believe that God so came down to this one tiny planet. The question would be embarrassing if we knew, 1, that there are rational creatures on any of the other bodies that float in space, 2, that they have, like us, fallen and need redemption, 3, that their redemption must be in the same mode as ours, 4, that redemption in this mode has been withheld from them. But we know none of them. The universe may be full of happy lives that never needed redemption. It may be full of lives that have been redeemed in modes suitable to their condition, of which we can form no conception. It may be full of lives that have been redeemed in the very same mode as ours. It may be full of lives that have been redeemed in the very same mode as our own. It may be full of things quite other than life, in which God is interested, though we are not. If it is maintained that anything so small as the earth must, in any event, be too unimportant to merit the love of the Creator, we reply that no Christian ever supposed we did merit it. Christ did not die for men because they were intrinsically worth dying for, but because he is intrinsically love, and therefore loves infinitely. And what, after all, does the size of a world or a creature tell us about its importance or value? There is no doubt that we all feel the incongruity of supposing, say, that the planet Earth might be more important than the great nebula in Andromeda. On the other hand, we are all equally certain that only a lunatic would think a man 6 feet high necessarily more important than a man 5 foot high, or a horse necessarily more important than a man, or a man's legs than his brain. In other words, this supposed ratio of size to importance feels plausible only when one of the sizes involved is very great. And that betrays the true basis of this type of thought. When a relation is perceived by reason, it is perceived to hold good universally. If our reason told us that size was proportional to importance, then small differences in size would be accompanied by small differences in importance, just as surely as great differences in size were accompanied by great differences in importance. Your 6 foot man would have to be slightly more valuable than the man of 5 feet, and your leg slightly more important than your brain, which everyone knows to be nonsense. The conclusion is inevitable. The importance we attach to great differences of size is an affair not of reason but of emotion, of that peculiar emotion which superiorities in size begin to produce in us only after a certain point of absolute size has been reached. So he says that this is an obvious problem for the size issue. I mean, we look at Earth and we say, well, it couldn't possibly be more important than the Andromeda Galaxy, which is very, very large in relation to Earth. But we don't do that when we look at the sizes of individuals. We wouldn't look at a baby or a toddler who's 3 feet tall and say that that baby, that toddler is more important than a man who's 6 foot tall. And that sort of betrays a problem with this sort of reasoning. Lewis says it's if an instrument of measurement, if an instrument of reasoning, a point of logic can't hold true universally, we reject it. Okay, well, Earth is less important than the Andromeda Galaxy because of the vast differences in their sizes, but we don't care at all about that size when the sizes aren't so great. Or we don't care at all about that argument, that point, that heuristic, when the sizes aren't so great. That betrays that there's a problem here, right? It betrays that it's really a product of emotion and not really of reason. We are inveterate poets, Lewis goes on. When a quantity is very great, we cease to regard it as a mere quantity. Our imaginations awake. Instead of mere quantity, we now have a quality, the sublime. But for this, the merely arithmetical greatness of the galaxy would be no more impressive than the figures in an account book. To a mind which did not share our emotions and lacked our imaginative energies, the argument against Christianity from the size of the universe would be simply unintelligible. I mean, if we can imagine a creature that has absolutely no imagination whatsoever, that has no poetic bent. In other words, that really has no emotions. The size of the Andromeda Galaxy versus the size of the Earth would look little more than the difference in that would look little more than the numbers in an accounting book. A large account versus a small account, which we are completely unimpressed by. But when numbers are very, very, very great, Lewis says, our imaginations awake. The gap between the sizes is filled by our sense of the sublime. That's what causes us to see the Andromeda Galaxy as more valuable than the Earth. That's what it causes us to see our immensity, or the immensity of the universe, rather, in relation to our size, as something qualitatively different. That's what pumps it up into this immense thing that where its immensity is an indication of its value, and its much greater value than our value. Lewis is saying that our imaginations fill up this gap. It's not really anything in the gaps themselves that indicates this. It's just how we perceive it. He says if there was a creature who didn't feel any of those things and heard us talking about the size of these things and how their size is, or their much greater size is an indication of their much greater value, they would be completely confused by that and wouldn't know how to respond to it. It is therefore from ourselves that the material universe derives its power to overawe us. Men of sensibility look up on the night sky with awe. Brutal and stupid men do not. When the silence of the eternal spaces terrified Pascal, it was Pascal's own greatness that enabled them to do so. To be frightened by the bigness of the absolute is, almost literally, to be frightened at our own shadow. For light years and geological periods are mere arithmetic until the shadow of man, the poet, the maker of myths, falls upon them. As a Christian, I do not say we are wrong to tremble at that shadow, for I believe it to be the shadow of an image of God. But if the vastness of nature ever threatens to overcrow our spirits, we must remember that it is only nature spiritualized by human imagination which does so. So Lewis takes this argument and very brilliantly turns it on its head. He says people who look up at the size of the universe and are completely overawed by it are brutes. They're stupid. It's sensible people that look up at the night sky and are awed by it, that have a sense of wonder about it. And he mentions the philosopher Blaise Pascal, and he says that when he looked up and was terrified by the eternal silence that he witnessed there, it was his glory that was shining through there. It was his shadow that he was seeing on the universe. Because humans let's take humans and remove them from that situation, and I say all you have before you because you're another human. It's hard to imagine a world without humans and then think about that world, but let's try to do it. Humans removed from the universe, all of that confusion or terror at the size of the universe is removed also. It's really humans that are creating this. It's humans that are creating this terror at the size of the universe. And why is that? Lewis says, well, it's our shadow that when we look at the size of the universe and our significance in it, it's really what we're seeing on that universe is our shadow cast on it. And we're right to tremble at it. It would be wrong not to tremble at it. But that trembling is not an indication of an argument against God, for example, or an argument against Christianity specifically. It's really a pillar of Christianity. It's a pillar of the existence of God, because if we weren't the kinds of beings who were divine, weren't the kinds of beings who were made in that divine image, then we wouldn't tremble at these things at all. These things would be completely unimportant to us. We'd be completely unimpressed by them. It's our imaginations that are creating this, and our imaginations are populated and inspired by divine presence. This suggests a possible answer to the question raised a few pages ago, why the size of the universe, known for centuries, should first in modern times become an argument against Christianity. Has it perhaps done so because in modern times the imagination has become more sensitive to bigness? From this point of view, the argument from size might almost be regarded as a byproduct of the Romantic movement in poetry. In addition to the absolute increase of imaginative vitality on this topic, there has pretty certainly been a decline on others. Any reader of old poetry can see that brightness appealed to ancient and medieval man more than bigness, and more than it does to us. Medieval thinkers believed that the stars must be somehow superior to the earth because they looked bright, and it did not. Moderns think that the galaxy ought to be more important than the earth because it is bigger. Both states of mind can produce good poetry. Both can supply mental pictures which rouse very respectable emotions of awe, humility, or exhilaration, but taken as serious philosophical argument, both are ridiculous. The atheist's argument from size is, in fact, an instance of just that picture thinking to which, as we shall see in a later chapter, the Christian is not committed. It is the particular mode in which picture thinking appears in the 20th century. For what we fondly call primitive errors do not pass away. They merely change their form.